Jamal Carter lay face down on the cold pavement, his cheek scraping against the rough asphalt. The weight of a gun pressed against the back of his head, held firm by Officer Richard Hayes. The man's face twisted, not with fear, but with something colder. Unquestioned authority mixed with bias. "Don't move," Hayes barked, ignoring the gold police badge just inches from Jamal's outstretched hand. Around them, cell phones recorded. People screamed, "He's a cop. Look at his badge." But no one listened. The wail of sirens closed in, tires screeched, and then, gun! A single gunshot rang out, 12 hours earlier. Detective Jamal Carter sat behind the wheel of his unmarked sedan, exhausted. His 12-hour shift had drained him. The Fairview Police Department was stretched thin, but that wasn't what weighed on him. It was the unspoken pressure, the constant need to prove himself as a black officer in a system that often saw his badge as a contradiction, not protection. The streets of Fairview were eerily quiet, lined with renovated brownstones on one side and boarded-up storefronts on the other. Gentrification had changed the buildings, but not the division underneath. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since lunch. Spotting Greenway Market, a small corner store, still glowing under a flickering neon sign, he pulled over. As he stepped inside, the clerk's eyes flicked to his red hoodie, then back to his face. Suspicion. Jamal grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of gum, sliding a $10 bill across the counter. The cashier hesitated, his hand hovering near the silent alarm button. Jamal saw it. He always saw it. Fighting the urge to flash his badge, he took his change and stepped back into the cold. That's when he felt it. Something was off. The street was too quiet. Then, a patrol car, moving slow, watching. Jamal recognized the officer immediately, Richard Hayes. They'd never clashed, but Jamal knew his type. The kind of cop who believed power was his birthright, who made routine stops just to flex authority. Jamal's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just a tired detective heading home. Still, Hayes didn't move on. Jamal reached his car, unlocked the door, and paused. Across the street, Hayes sat motionless, staring, deciding. Jamal's jaw tightened. He knew this wasn't over. Slipping into the driver's seat, he locked the doors and started the engine. The patrol car didn't follow yet, but the air had changed. The tension was there, an unspoken promise. By sunrise, Jamal Carter's life would never be the same. Jamal Carter kept his movement steady, careful not to give Officer Richard Hayes any reason to escalate. He flicked on his blinker long before making the turn, rolled to a complete stop at the next sign, and continued down the empty street. Every action was deliberate, precise, because for a black man behind the wheel, perfection wasn't just a habit, it was survival. Inside the patrol car trailing behind, Officer Richard Hayes chewed on the frayed end of a toothpick, his gaze locked onto the vehicle ahead. His radio crackled to life. Unit 47, robbery reported at Jefferson and Pine. Suspect, black male, dark hoodie, possibly armed. Proceed with caution. That was all Hayes needed to hear. He didn't see a tired detective heading home after a long shift. He saw a suspect, a hoodie, a black man alone at night. It all clicked into place in the worst way possible. Tossing the toothpick aside, Hayes' hand hovered over his radio. He could have called for backup, but why bother? He was convinced he had the situation under control. Jamal turned onto a quieter street, hoping Hayes would lose interest. Instead, the sharp flash of red and blue lights flooded his mirrors, and his heart sank. Not tonight, not again. He pulled over, keeping his hands visible. The same practiced routine he had followed too many times before. The engine off, window down, hands on the wheel, standard protocol. 3 simple actions that, if ignored, could mean life or death. Footsteps crunched against the pavement, slow and deliberate. Hayes emerged from the shadows, his face rigid under the cold streetlight glow. His hand rested lightly on the grip of his holstered pistol. "License and registration," he ordered, his voice clipped, scanning the interior of the car as if he expected a threat. Jamal took a steady breath before speaking. "Officer, I'm Detective Jamal Carter, Homicide Division, badge number 48217. I'm heading home after a shift." Hayes didn't blink. He didn't even glance at the badge that Jamal slowly pulled from his jacket pocket. "Step out of the vehicle." Jamal froze. His mind raced through the possibilities. If he refused, it was non-compliance. If he moved too quickly, it was suspicious behavior. There was no right answer, only survival. Look, I'm not armed. I'm on your side. Call it in and you'll see. I said out, now. The words sliced through the night, sharp and unyielding. Jamal knew better than to argue. Slowly, painfully slowly, he opened the door, keeping his hands raised. The cold air bit at his skin as he stepped onto the pavement. That was when Hayes saw it, the holstered service weapon under Jamal's jacket. Standard issue, legal, registered, none of it mattered. Gun! Hayes's voice rang out, and his weapon was drawn in an instant, aimed directly at Jamal's chest. Time seemed to slow. Jamal didn't move, his hands still raised, heart pounding against his ribs. Across the street, a woman's voice cut through the silence. He's a cop. Look at his badge. But Hayes wasn't listening. Face down, now. Jamal had spent years earning that badge, working twice as hard for half the recognition. And in an instant, it meant nothing. Pride fought against training, but pride didn't save lives. He dropped to the ground, arms stretched out, his badge still clutched in his hand. The pavement was freezing against his cheek. The world shrank to the sound of his own breathing, the sharp click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists, and the weight of a knee pressing into his back. Stop resisting. Jamal hadn't moved. More sirens wailed in the distance, another patrol car screeching to a halt. Two more officers spilled out, their weapons drawn, not at Hayes but at Jamal. Then Sergeant Lila Torres arrived. She stepped out of her car, her sharp gaze sweeping over the scene, taking in the sight of a black man on the ground, a white officer standing over him, and a crowd filming every second. She didn't draw her weapon. She didn't need to. Authority radiated from her as she spoke. What's going on here? Hayes straightened, his voice quick and confident. Robbery suspect. Black male, dark hoodie, possibly armed. He resisted. Torres studied Jamal, recognition flashing in her eyes. They had worked cases together, argued over strategies, shared coffee during late-night stakeouts. But now she hesitated, not because she didn't know who he was, but because she knew exactly what this was. Carter, she said, her voice tight. Is this true? Jamal's jaw clenched. Detective Jamal Carter, Homicide Division, badge number 48217. Call it in. Torres turned to Hayes. Did you verify his badge? Hayes stiffened. Didn't need to. He matched the description. Hoodie, black male, possibly armed. Torres' face darkened. Possibly armed? You cuffed a detective and didn't verify his identity? The crowd murmured, growing louder. Phones were still recording. Too many witnesses. Torres turned to Officer Riley. Run the badge number, now. Riley hesitated. A single glance at Hayes' face told her everything, but she couldn't ignore a direct order. Reluctantly, she reached for her radio. Dispatch, verify badge number 48217. Detective Jamal Carter, homicide. A tense silence. Then the dispatcher's voice crackled to life. Badge number 48217 confirmed, active duty, no warrants, no alerts. The truth dropped like a hammer. Torres' jaw tightened. Uncuff him, now. Hayes didn't move. Now, Officer Hayes. With a muttered curse, Hayes yanked the cuffs off. The metal bit one last time into Jamal's wrist before falling away. He slowly pushed himself up, ignoring the sting where the cuffs had dug into his skin. His breath was steady, but inside he was raging. The crowd erupted. Cheers, outrage, shouts of, "We told you he was a cop." But Jamal barely heard them. His eyes locked onto Hayes. This isn't over, Hayes muttered, his voice low, thick with resentment. Jamal didn't flinch. No, he said coldly. It's just the beginning. The truth was already out. The cameras had captured everything. The video would spread, but Jamal knew how these things went. Would there be accountability? Or would the system double down, smooth things over, and move on like nothing happened? As he picked up his badge from the ground, the sickening truth settled in his gut. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about an entire system. And next time, he might not walk away. Jamal Carter felt the weight of his badge in his pocket, the cold metal pressing against his leg like a cruel reminder. The words "to protect and serve" were nothing more than an empty promise. Across from him, Officer Richard Hayes stood by his patrol car, jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might crack. He didn't apologize. He didn't admit fault. He just stood there, hatred simmering beneath the surface, barely held back by the cameras still rolling across the street. The crowd hadn't dispersed. If anything, it had grown. People stood on porches, leaned out of windows, and gathered on sidewalks, their faces a mix of anger, relief, and exhaustion. Someone in the crowd called out, "That's what happens when you're black, even with a badge." Jamal's fists curled at his sides. He wanted to yell, to demand accountability, to make them feel the rage burning in his chest. But years of training as a detective and as a black man who had learned to navigate a world that saw him as a threat first and a person second, kept him in check. He took a slow, steady breath, forcing the fire inside him to simmer instead of explode. "Write this up," Sergeant Lila Torres ordered her officers. "Full incident report, body cam footage, witness statements." Hayes didn't move, his glare borne to Jamal, his pride too wounded to acknowledge what had just happened. Men like him would rather drown in their own arrogance than admit they were wrong. Jamal shook his head, voice tight with restrained fury. "Don't bother, Sergeant. We both know how this ends." A sanitized report, a quiet misunderstanding, and Hayes would be back on the street tomorrow like nothing had happened. Torres didn't argue. She couldn't. The system wasn't built to hold men like Hayes accountable. It was built to protect them, to bury moments like this under paperwork and bureaucratic language until the outrage faded and life moved on. But life never really moved on for people like Jamal. The scars stayed. "Get home safe, detective," Torres said quietly, as if it were an apology. Jamal didn't reply. He just turned and walked toward his car, his shoulders tight with the weight of injustice. The crowd parted for him, murmuring words of support, but their faces were tired, resigned. They had seen this play out before. They would see it again. As Jamal slid into the driver's seat, the adrenaline that had kept him steady began to crash. His hands trembled against the steering wheel. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, notifications flooding in as the video of his arrest spread like wildfire across social media. He ignored them. He just wanted to go home, to pretend, just for a few hours, that the badge still meant something. But fate had other plans. Across town, Richard Hayes stood outside his patrol car, watching Jamal drive away. His face twisted into something ugly, part wounded pride, part simmering hatred. He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over the screen before typing a message. "I'm not done with him." Jamal finally pulled into his driveway. His townhouse was modest, the porch light flickering, another thing on the long list of repairs he hadn't gotten around to. He sat in the car for a moment, head resting against the seat, exhaustion sinking into his bones. He had faced plenty of racism before. Covert glances, patronizing comments, the constant need to prove himself. But this was different. This was violent, raw, public. When he stepped inside, Maya was waiting. Her eyes were wide with worry, her phone still in her hand. "I saw the video," she said, voice shaking. "Are you okay?" Jamal forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just another day in the life, right?" Maya didn't smile. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against the raw red marks on his wrists. "This isn't normal, Jamal. It's not just another day. It's wrong. They could have killed you." He kissed her forehead, silent because she was right. They both knew it. His phone buzzed again. He sighed, expecting more notifications, but when he glanced at the screen, his stomach tightened. An anonymous text message. "Back off, detective. Next time, you won't walk away." Jamal's breath caught. The chill that had settled in after the confrontation flared into something colder, sharper. This wasn't over. Hayes, or someone else in his circle, wasn't content with humiliation. They wanted revenge. He showed Maya the message. Her face paled. "Jamal, you need to report this." "To who?" he snapped, bitterness bleeding into his voice. "The same department that threw me to the ground? The same system that'll call this a prank until someone gets hurt?" Maya swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes. "So what do we do? Just wait for them to come knocking?" Jamal didn't answer. He stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just about him anymore. It never had been. It was about every black man stopped for matching a description. Every officer of color forced to prove they belonged. Every family who got a knock on the door instead of a phone call. Oh, mister. He stood, his shoulders squaring. We don't wait, he said quietly. We fight. We make sure the world sees this for what it is. But how do you fight a system designed to protect itself? How do you stand tall when the very foundation beneath your feet is cracked and crumbling? The next morning, Jamal woke to the relentless buzzing of his phone. The soft light of dawn filtered through the blinds, but the world outside was far from quiet. His notifications were endless. Missed calls, texts, emails, social media alerts. He wasn't just a trending topic. He was the story. News headlines screamed from every corner of the internet. Detective mistaken for suspect by fellow officer sparks outrage. Black cop held at gunpoint despite identifying himself. Badge doesn't protect blackness. Viral arrest raises questions about policing bias. Maya walked in, her own phone in hand. It's everywhere. CNN, Twitter, the local news. It's all over. Jamal exhaled slowly. Good. Maybe now they'll listen. Maya's expression didn't soften. Listen or retaliate? You know how this works, Jamal. They don't fix the system. They protect it. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Hope the views were worth it. Watch your back, detective. Jamal's grip tightened around the phone. The threats had started last night, but in the harsh light of day, they felt more real, more personal. The precinct was no better. Conversations hushed as he passed. The department wasn't rallying behind him. It was closing ranks. And by the time Captain Reynolds called him into a meeting, the message was clear. They weren't investigating Hayes. They were investigating him. Jamal Carter knew the moment he stepped into the precinct that something was off. A chill ran down his spine, the kind of instinct that had kept him alive for years on the force. This wasn't just a routine case, it was a setup, the kind you don't walk away from unscathed. Detective Carla Ramirez caught up with him in the hallway, her expression tight with worry. She leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. Jamal, this stinks. They're setting you up. He didn't flinch. I know. His voice was low, controlled, but inside rage simmered. But I'm not walking into it blind. He spent the next few hours working the case by the book. He visited the corner store, spoke to the shaken cashier, a middle-aged man who avoided eye contact and stumbled over details. The surveillance footage was grainy, glitching at key moments, making it impossible to identify the suspect. It felt deliberate, like someone had tampered with it. Every lead circled back to the same vague description: black male, dark hoodie, possibly armed. The same description they'd pinned on him days earlier. By noon, Jamal had enough to confirm his suspicions, but not enough to prove them. Frustration gnawed at him as he stepped back into the precinct. Then he saw Richard Hayes. The officer was standing beside Captain Reynolds' desk, a file in hand. His smirk was sharp, predatory. Carter, Hayes called, voice dripping with false camaraderie. Got some news for you. Jamal's heart sank. He didn't need to hear it to know the game had shifted. Fingerprint analysis came back from the robbery scene, Hayes continued, flipping open the file with theatrical flair. Guess whose prints were found on the counter? He held up a photo, Jamal's own personnel file, his fingerprint card. The room spun, his mind scrambled for an explanation. He'd never been near that store beyond casual visits for coffee or snacks. There was no reason for his prints to be there, unless someone had put them there. This is bull. Enough, Captain Reynolds cut him off, face impassive. Internal Affairs has already been notified. Until this is sorted, Detective Carter, you're suspended. Badge and weapon. Now. The bullpen fell silent. Eyes turned toward Jamal. Some wide with disbelief, others, like Hayes's, glittering with satisfaction. Jamal forced himself to breathe. I didn't do this, he said quietly, pulling his badge from his belt and placing it on Reynolds' desk. And you know it. Reynolds didn't flinch. Save it for your union rep. Jamal unholstered his weapon, setting it down beside the badge. The weight of it left his hand like an anchor being cut loose. But he didn't need a gun to feel powerful. He needed the truth. And now, stripped of his authority, he had nothing left to lose. The holding cell was cold. Jamal sat on the hard bench, his head in his hands, Morrison had won, at least for now. It wasn't just about a bruised ego anymore. This was systematic. Someone higher up wanted him silenced, discredited, erased. The arrest, the threats, the fabricated evidence. It all pointed to one chilling conclusion. The system wasn't failing him. It was targeting him. Hours passed, no lawyer, no explanation, just silence. Just the cold realization that without his badge, he was nothing more than another black man behind bars. Another statistic in a system designed to crush dissent. Then Carla Ramirez appeared. Her face was pale, drawn. She didn't waste time. She slipped a burner phone through the cell bars, her voice urgent. Don't ask how I got this. Just use it. Get your story out before they bury it. Jamal stared at the phone in his hands. His heart pounded. He didn't need the badge to seek justice. He just needed the world to see the truth. The video hit the internet minutes later. Jamal's face filled the screen, bruised, exhausted, but defiant. My name is Detective Jamal Carter. If you're seeing this, it means the system I served for over a decade is trying to silence me. I was framed for a robbery I didn't commit. My fingerprints were planted. The officer responsible? Richard Hayes, the same man who held a gun to my head days ago, ignoring my badge, my identity, my life. I'm not the first black man to be targeted by the system, but I'll be damned if I let them make me the last. He uploaded it to every platform he could. Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook. He didn't have to wait long. The world was already watching. Within minutes, the video spread like wildfire. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded. #justice for Jamal started trending. And then the threats came. One message stood out. You just made yourself a bigger target. Hope you're ready. Jamal gritted his teeth. He was beyond ready. 2 hours later, Carla returned. It's blowing up, she said breathlessly. The precinct is losing its mind. But more importantly, someone inside leaked Morrison's disciplinary record. It's worse than we thought. She handed him a file. Excessive force, racial profiling, a wrongful death settlement. The department had known, and they still let him patrol. Because he was useful, Carla muttered. He did the dirty work they didn't want tied back to them. But now, he's a liability. Jamal clenched his jaw. And when the department sees someone as a liability, they cut them loose. Or they find a scapegoat, Carla said. His mind raced. The body cam footage. It hadn't disappeared. It had been buried. Jamal's eyes sharpened. We need that footage. Carla hesitated. It's locked in evidence. Only command-level access can pull it without raising alarms. Jamal smirked. Good thing we know someone with command-level access. An hour later, Carla led him through the back halls of the precinct. Sergeant Torres was waiting. She tossed him a plain hoodie. You better be right about this. Jamal pulled it on. I don't need you to believe me. Just believe the facts when you see them. They slipped into evidence storage. Jamal found the digital terminal. Search, incident report, January 14th. Officer Richard Hayes. Body cam footage. A single file appeared. Vid WWAM 47, Hayes C. Jamal copied it onto a flash drive. His hands shook. Torres whispered, We've got 5 minutes. Then he saw another log, an authorization request under his name. That's how they got my prints, he muttered. They pulled my old background check, lifted the prints, and planted them at the scene beside him. Carla paled. It's worse than we thought. It always is. They watched the footage together. It showed everything. Jamal presenting his badge, Hayes ignoring it, the crowd screaming, he's a cop. Hayes escalating anyway. Then at the end, Hayes turned to his partner, thinking the camera was off. Badge don't mean shit if you're black. One less problem if he resists next time. Torres exhaled sharply. Jamal's voice was cold. There it is. Proof. Torres nodded. We take this to the chief. Jamal shook his head. No, we take it to the world. That night, the footage hit the internet. The public erupted. The department had covered for a racist cop, but they wouldn't cover him anymore. Jamal Carter sat in his darkened living room, his phone buzzing endlessly. The world had seen the truth. Richard Hayes had been exposed. The corruption laid bare. The protests outside Mason Heights Police Department were growing, demanding justice, but Jamal knew better. Hayes wasn't the type to go quietly, And whoever had helped frame him was still out there, waiting for their next move. The next morning, Jamal woke to another flood of messages. Some were supportive, but the threats were worse. Death threats, doxing, promises of revenge. In the kitchen, Maya stood with her arms crossed, staring at the news. "They suspended Hayes," she muttered, "but no charges, no arrest." "They're waiting for people to move on," Jamal sighed. His phone buzzed. "Carla, get out of the house, now." Jamal's blood ran cold. "What's going on?" "Hayes is off the grid." He wiped his phone, cleaned out his locker. "He's coming for you." Jamal locked eyes with Maya. "We're leaving. Now." He ushered her out the door, scanning the street. That's when he saw it. A dark sedan, no plates, idling at the corner. "Maya, get in the car." Too late. The engine roared, tires screeched. Hayes, behind the wheel. Jamal yanked Maya back as the car swerved toward them, missing by inches before disappearing down the street. Inside. Now. They stumbled back into the house. Jamal grabbed his phone. Voicemail. Torres, Carla, no answer. Then, crack. Glass shattered. A brick hit the carpet. A note, scrawled in red ink. Last warning. Back off or bleed. Jamal exhaled slowly. This wasn't ending until one of them was gone. He turned to Maya. "Get to Carla's. Lock the doors. Don't open for anyone but me." "What about you?" she whispered. "I'll meet you there." Maya hesitated, but Jamal pressed the keys into her hand. He watched her disappear down the alley before turning back. Pulling out his burner phone, he typed a single message. "Hayes is rogue, threatened my life, need backup, now." A reply came instantly. Not from Carla, not from Torres, from Hayes. "Too late, look behind you." Jamal's heart pounded, the door exploded open. Hayes stood there, gun drawn, face twisted with rage. "Thought you could ruin me?" Hayes sneered. "Thought cameras and protests would save you? They don't mean shit when you're dead." Jamal raised his hands, mind racing. "Think this through. You kill me, you'll never see daylight again." "Don't care," Hayes growled, raising the gun. Sirens, screeching tires. Hayes hesitated. Jamal didn't. He lunged. The gun fired. Missed. They crashed into the walls, fists flying. Hayes outweighed him, but Jamal had something else. Clarity, purpose. The front door burst open. Torres, gun drawn. "Freeze!" Hayes hesitated. Then he dove for the gun. 3 shots rang out. Hayes hit the floor. Dead. Jamal stood over the body, chest heaving. It was over. But the real fight had just begun. Jamal Carter sat at the back of an unmarked car, watching the Mason Heights Police Department from across the street. The once imposing building, a symbol of law and order, now stood exposed, a fortress of corruption crumbling under the weight of undeniable truth. Reporters swarmed the entrance, microphones thrust into the faces of officers trying to dodge questions. Protesters lined the sidewalks, their voices rising in unison. "Clean house! End the cover-up!" His phone buzzed. Carla Ramirez. "It's happening," she said. "Reynolds is in custody. Conspiracy, obstruction of justice, abuse of power. The feds picked him up an hour ago, no bail." Jamal exhaled slowly, the break they had fought for, but satisfaction didn't come easy. What about the others? 3 more arrests so far. Internal Affairs, Evidence Division. One of them, the guy who buried your body cam footage. More names keep surfacing. It always goes deeper. Torres slid into the driver's seat, handing him coffee. "The chief's holding a press conference in an hour. Word is she's throwing everyone under the bus to save herself." "Let her," Jamal muttered, "as long as the truth gets out." Still, he couldn't resist pulling up the live stream when the press conference began. The police chief, rigid and uncomfortable, stood at the podium, flanked by city officials who looked equally uneasy. "Effective immediately, Captain Reynolds has been terminated," she announced. "The officers involved in fabricating evidence against Detective Carter are under investigation. Any officer found complicit will face disciplinary action and potential criminal charges." Jamal's lips curled. Disciplinary action. Always the softest possible consequence when it came to the powerful. The chief continued, promising mandatory bias training and an external oversight committee. Carla snorted over the phone. "Like a PowerPoint is going to fix decades of systemic racism." Jamal didn't answer. Change didn't come from workshops and committees. It came from pressure, constant, relentless pressure. Later that afternoon, he stepped into the precinct. Conversations hushed as he walked past, eyes flicking toward the badge now clipped firmly to his belt. Some officers looked relieved, others angry. The cracks in the system had been revealed, but the foundation still stood. Carla met him in the conference room, exhaustion written across her face. The task force is pushing a full audit of past cases Reynolds touched. We're already finding patterns. Evidence lost. Complaints buried. Testimonies coerced. Jamal clenched his jaw. Of course we are. She studied him. You don't have to stay in this fight. You expose the truth. You can walk away. Start fresh. Outside the window, protesters still held signs. His name beside the word justice. He thought of the faces over the years, the victims ignored, lives shattered by a system built to protect itself. Walking away meant leaving them behind. I can't, he said finally. Not until the system's too broken to rebuild the same way. That night, Jamal returned home. The house still bore scars, windows boarded from where Morrison had shattered them. The scuff marks on the door where he had kicked it in, the ghost of a past week that had nearly ended him. Maya met him on the porch. You coming in or planning to stand there all night? Jamal smiled for the first time in days. Just taking it in. We made it. She stepped closer, fingers brushing his. For now. But next time they'd be ready. The sun dipped low over Mason Heights, casting long shadows over a city that had begun to heal. Murals covered the walls, painted by artists from the very community that had once felt powerless. At the heart of one stood a towering figure, not a hero, but a reminder. A man in a hoodie and jeans, holding up a badge, not as a symbol of power, but of accountability. Below, in bold letters, justice is watching. Jamal Carter stood across the street, hands in his pockets. He hadn't asked for the attention, hadn't wanted to be a face for change. But fate rarely asked for permission. The department had undergone a massive overhaul, not from goodwill, but from necessity. Investigations had uncovered years of misconduct. Reynolds was just the tip of the iceberg. More arrests followed, high-ranking officers stripped of their badges. The community, once ignored, now demanded transparency. Jamal hadn't returned to business as usual. He couldn't. After months of testimony, interviews, and endless fights, he had taken a new role, one he never imagined. He now led the department's accountability and reform task force. It wasn't about chasing criminals. It was about stopping the system from creating them. A familiar voice called out behind him. Detective Carter. Carla jogged up, tucking a folder under her arm. Knew I'd find you here. Jamal nodded toward the mural. Keeps me grounded. Carla smirked. Grounded? You're practically a local legend now. Kids are dressing up as you for career day. Jamal chuckled, shaking his head. They should aim higher. She handed him the folder. Final audit report. Every officer involved in your setup, fired, indicted, or both. Even the IA guys who looked the other way. Jamal scanned the pages, recognizing names that once held power. Men who had built their careers on silencing the truth, now stripped of the authority they had abused. Good, he murmured. One less crack for someone to slip through. They stood in silence, the hum of the city around them. Heading to the community center? Carla asked. Yeah, Jamal replied, already moving. The kids are expecting me. The community center had become his sanctuary, a place where the next generation could see justice as something real, something worth fighting for. Inside, walls were covered with posters about civil rights, leadership, and empowerment. A boy, no older than 12, looked up from a laptop. His eyes widened. Detective Carter, you're back. Promised I'd help you finish that mock trial, didn't I? Jamal grinned. The boy nodded eagerly, then hesitated. Can I ask you something? Shoot. Why'd you go back? The boy asked. After everything they did to you? Why not just leave? Jamal knelt, meeting his gaze. He had asked himself the same question. But now the answer was clear. Because leaving wouldn't change anything, he said. The system's broken, yeah. But if people like us walk away, it stays broken. We don't fix it by abandoning the fight. We fix it by staying, pushing, holding the line, so that the next time someone like me gets stopped for fitting a description, They walk away. Safe. Free. The boy nodded, absorbing the words like scripture. Behind them, Maya stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching with quiet pride. As the kids returned to work, Jamal stepped outside. Maya fell into step beside him. "You really think it'll stick this time?" she asked, glancing at the bustling streets, at officers walking beats under real oversight. Jamal didn't answer right away. Change was fragile, always at risk of being rolled back. But the difference now? People weren't sleeping anymore. They were awake, watching, and unwilling to settle for empty promises. Jamal looked at the badge clipped to his belt. For years it had been a shield, then a target. Now, a weapon for change. "We'll make it stick," he said, walking toward the future, one way or another. As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting golden light over Mason Heights, Jamal Carter stood before the mural bearing his likeness. The words beneath it, "Justice is watching," weren't just paint on a wall. They were a promise, a warning, a call to action. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, the system knew someone was watching. His phone buzzed, a message from Carla. "DOJ just announced a federal oversight committee. It's happening. We did it." Jamal exhaled, the weight on his chest finally easing. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a shift in power. No more cover-ups, no more unchecked authority. The system had been forced to answer for its sins, and now change was no longer a request, it was a demand. Maya stepped beside him, slipping her hand into his. "So what's next?" Jamal looked at the street, where officers now patrolled under the eyes of the people, their authority no longer absolute but accountable. "We keep pushing," he said, "because the moment we stop, they start again." The fight wasn't over, but for the first time the system was afraid, not of power but of the truth.